What if I told you that the darkest wizard of all time, the one who nearly brought the wizarding world to its knees, could have been a hero? What if everything we know about Lord Voldemort, about Tom Riddle, could have been different with one single decision? Today we're exploring one of the most fascinating alternate timeline scenarios in the Harry Potter universe. What if Voldemort had been sorted into Gryffindor? Before we dive deep into this alternate reality, let's remember who Tom Riddle actually was. Born on New Year's Eve in 1926, Tom Marvolo Riddle entered the world in a Muggle orphanage, the product of a love potion and abandonment. His mother, Merope Gaunt, died shortly after his birth, and his Muggle father wanted nothing to do with him. By the time Albus Dumbledore arrived at Wool's orphanage to tell young Tom about his magical heritage, the boy had already discovered he was different. He could make things happen. He could make bad things happen to people who annoyed him. He could speak to snakes. And perhaps most tellingly, he had already learned to use his powers to control, manipulate, and terrify. When Tom Riddle arrived at Hogwarts in 1938, the Sorting Hat barely touched his head before shouting Slytherin. It seemed inevitable. He was ambitious, cunning, resourceful, and determined to prove himself superior to everyone around him. The House of Salazar Slytherin welcomed him with open arms, and there, surrounded by pure-blood supremacists and students who valued power above all else, Tom Riddle found his path to becoming Lord Voldemort. But what if that moment had gone differently? Imagine the Great Hall on that September evening in 1938. Young Tom Riddle, 11 years old, walking up to the stool with that carefully composed expression he'd perfected at the orphanage. The Sorting Hat is placed on his head, and it begins to search through his mind, sifting through his thoughts, his fears, his desires, his potential. The hat sees his ambition, certainly. It sees his cunning and his resourcefulness. But it also sees something else. It sees a boy who has taken extraordinary risks simply to survive. It sees someone with an almost reckless courage, someone who has faced down bullies and authorities without flinching. It sees determination that borders on the fearless. It sees a boy who, despite everything, walked into a world of magic with his head held high, ready to conquer whatever came next. And in this timeline, the Sorting Hat makes a different choice. It considers that perhaps what this boy needs is not an environment that will nurture his worst instincts, but one that might challenge them. It thinks about Godric Gryffindor's belief that courage and nerve matter more than birthright. And so, after a long pause that makes the entire hall hold its breath, the hat calls out, "Gryffindor." The Gryffindor table erupts in applause, as they always do for their new housemates. But Tom Riddle sits frozen for a moment. This wasn't what he expected. He'd heard the whispers about Slytherin being the house of the ambitious, the powerful, the great wizards. He'd heard that Salazar Slytherin himself could speak to serpents, just like Tom. In his mind, Slytherin was where he belonged, where he could forge the connections he'd need to rise above his orphan status and become someone important. But Gryffindor? The house of the foolishly brave. The house that seemed to value reckless heroics over calculated success. Yet as Tom walks to the Gryffindor table, something interesting happens. He's greeted warmly, enthusiastically. These students don't care that he's wearing second-hand robes or that he has no family name to speak of. They care that he's one of them now. A Gryffindor. And Tom Riddle, who has never truly belonged anywhere, who has spent his entire life as an outsider, feels something he doesn't quite recognize. It's not warmth, not yet, but it's the smallest crack in the armor he's built around himself. Now, let's be clear about something important. Tom Riddle's psychological issues run deep. He was born under the influence of a love potion, which, according to J.K. Rowling, left him incapable of understanding love. He grew up in a harsh orphanage during the Great Depression, learning early that the world was cruel and that power was the only thing that mattered. He displayed sociopathic tendencies from a very young age, hurting other children, stealing their possessions, hanging a boy's rabbit from the rafters, luring 2 children into a cave to terrorize them. These aren't the actions of a normal child having a difficult time. These are red flags of someone with a fundamental disconnect from empathy and human connection. So the question becomes, can a Hogwarts house really change someone's fundamental nature? Can environment overcome what might be inherent psychological conditions? Or would Tom Riddle have become a dark wizard regardless of where the Sorting Hat placed him? This is the central tension we need to explore, and the answer is more complex than a simple yes or no. In Gryffindor, Tom Riddle would be surrounded by a completely different peer group. Instead of students like Abraxas Malfoy, whose family fortune was built on pure blood supremacy, Tom would be eating breakfast next to students who genuinely believed in standing up for what's right. Instead of dorm mates who whispered about the glory of Salazar Slytherin's vision for a pure wizarding world, Tom would be sleeping in a tower where the other boys talked about Quidditch, about their latest adventures, about how they'd stood up to a bully or helped a younger student. The Gryffindor common room itself would be a different environment. Where the Slytherin common room is described as cold, dungeon-like, with an atmosphere of secrecy and exclusivity, the Gryffindor common room is warm, welcoming, with its cozy fireplace and comfortable armchairs. It's a place that encourages camaraderie rather than competition, loyalty to your housemates rather than constant jockeying for position. For a boy who has never had a real home, who has never felt genuine warmth from another person, this environment could be transformative, or it could feel suffocating and false. Tom Riddle was extraordinarily intelligent and perceptive. He would quickly understand what was expected of a Gryffindor. He would see how his housemates behaved, what they valued, what earned respect in the tower. And Tom, being Tom, would adapt. He was always a master of manipulation, of presenting the face that people wanted to see. At the orphanage, he could be the perfect polite boy when Mrs. Cole was watching. At Hogwarts, in our original timeline, he was the model student, the charming boy who teachers trusted implicitly. In Gryffindor, he would learn to play a different role. But here's where it gets interesting. When you pretend to be something long enough, when you're rewarded for certain behaviors and see that other behaviors lead to isolation or disapproval, you begin to internalize those patterns. This is basic behavioral psychology. If Tom Riddle spent 7 years being rewarded for acts of courage rather than cunning, for helping others rather than manipulating them, for standing with his housemates rather than above them, those patterns would begin to shape him, even if his underlying psychology remained unchanged. Consider his relationship with Albus Dumbledore in this alternate timeline. In the original story, Dumbledore was the only person who ever really saw through Tom Riddle. From their very first meeting at the orphanage, Dumbledore recognized the darkness in the boy. At Hogwarts, Dumbledore watched Tom carefully, never quite trusting him despite his perfect student act. Dumbledore was the one teacher Tom couldn't completely fool, and Tom resented him for it. This created a dynamic where Tom saw Dumbledore as an obstacle, someone who needed to be circumvented rather than impressed. But if Tom were sorted into Gryffindor, Dumbledore's approach might be different. Dumbledore, who valued love and choice above all else, who believed that our choices mattered more than our abilities, might see Tom's placement in Gryffindor as significant. Not because it proved Tom was good, but because it suggested Tom had the capacity for courage, which is in many ways the foundation of all other virtues. Dumbledore might still watch Tom carefully, but he might also invest more energy in actively mentoring him, in trying to channel Tom's obvious brilliance toward positive ends. Imagine Dumbledore, already a Transfiguration professor at this time, taking a special interest in his talented Gryffindor student. He might invite Tom to his office for tea, discussing magical theory and the ethical implications of powerful magic. He might share stories of his own youth, his own ambitions, his own mistakes. Dumbledore, who had learned the hard way that power without wisdom leads to tragedy, could see in Tom a reflection of his younger self. And unlike in the original timeline, where Tom was surrounded by influences that encouraged his worst instincts, Dumbledore's mentorship might actually take root in soil that's been prepared differently by the Gryffindor environment. Tom Riddle's friend group would be entirely different in this scenario. In Slytherin, Tom cultivated a following. They weren't really friends. They were disciples. Students like Lestrange, Avery, and Nott, who would later become Death Eaters, were drawn to Tom's charisma and power. They looked up to him as a leader, someone who would restore wizard supremacy and pure-blood privilege. Tom used them, manipulated them, and eventually transformed them into his first followers in his rise to power. In Gryffindor, genuine friendship might be harder to fake. Gryffindors value authenticity, loyalty, and courage. They're less likely to follow someone simply because they're powerful or charismatic. They want to know that you'll have their back when it counts, that you're not just using them for your own advancement. For Tom, who has never had a real friend, who doesn't understand genuine human connection, this would be challenging, but it would also be an opportunity. Perhaps Tom would become friends with a particularly persistent Gryffindor student, someone who saw past his polished exterior and decided they were going to be friends whether Tom liked it or not. Someone who invited Tom to join their study group, not because Tom needed the help academically, but because that's what friends do. Someone who included Tom in their trips to Hogsmeade, their late-night conversations in the common room, their harmless pranks and adventures. At first, Tom might find this annoying, even contemptible. But over time, the experience of being treated as a person rather than as a tool or a threat might begin to affect him. Let's talk about the Chamber of Secrets, because this is a crucial turning point in Tom Riddle's journey to becoming Voldemort. In the original timeline, Tom discovered he was the heir of Slytherin during his time at Hogwarts. He learned to speak Parseltongue, found the entrance to the chamber, and unleashed the basilisk that killed Moaning Myrtle. He framed Hagrid for the crime, got a special award for services to the school, and used the incident to create his first Horcrux. The Chamber of Secrets was where Tom Riddle truly became something monstrous. In our Gryffindor timeline, would this still happen? Tom would still be a Parselmouth. That's a genetic trait he inherited from the Gaunt line, and it would still mark him as different. When other students discovered this ability, their reaction might be very different depending on Tom's house. In Slytherin, being a Parselmouth would make Tom special, connecting him to the founder himself. In Gryffindor, it might be seen as weird, maybe even a little dark, but not necessarily as something that elevated Tom above his peers. The crucial question is whether Tom would still feel the same drive to find the Chamber of Secrets and prove his heritage. In the original timeline, Tom was obsessed with his ancestry. He was desperate to prove he wasn't just some orphan, that he had a great lineage, that he was special. He rejected his Muggle father's name and embraced his connection to Salazar Slytherin because it gave him an identity, a legacy. In Gryffindor, surrounded by students who didn't care about blood purity or ancient lineages, would Tom still feel that same desperate need to prove his worth through his ancestry? It's possible that Tom would still be curious about the chamber. His intellectual curiosity and desire to uncover Hogwarts' secrets would probably remain. But the context would be different. If Tom had been shaped by 7 years in Gryffindor, if he had developed even the slightest attachment to his housemates, if he had come to see Hogwarts as something resembling a home, would he really unleash a monster that could kill students? Would he still frame Hagrid, who might be his friend in this timeline? This is where we see the real test of whether environment can overcome nature. Let's consider a scenario where Tom does discover the Chamber of Secrets, but makes a different choice. Perhaps he tells Dumbledore about it instead of opening it. Imagine Tom, conflicted, knowing that Slytherin's monster lies beneath the school, recognizing his ability to control it, but also understanding that using it would betray everything his house stands for. If he spent 5 years in Gryffindor, being shaped by its values, seeing courage and honor modeled by his peers and teachers, the choice might be different. Telling Dumbledore would itself be an act of courage. It would mean admitting his Parselmouth ability, revealing his connection to Slytherin, making himself vulnerable. But it would also be the right thing to do. If Tom made that choice, if he confided in Dumbledore about the chamber, it would be a turning point. Dumbledore would recognize the significance of this decision. Tom Riddle, who could have used the chamber for his own glory, who could have kept the secret and wielded that power, instead chose to protect the school. That would be the moment Dumbledore might truly believe that Tom could be saved, that the Sorting Hat had been right to put him in Gryffindor. But let's not be naive here. Tom Riddle's issues go beyond what house he's in. His fear of death, which would later drive him to create Horcruxes and pursue immortality at any cost, isn't something that Gryffindor values would necessarily address. In fact, Gryffindor courage often involves accepting death as a possibility, even a necessity, when standing up for what's right. This would be fundamentally at odds with Tom's core fear. Gryffindors charge into danger. Tom wants to conquer death itself. Tom's inability to love or form genuine emotional connections isn't going to be cured by being in a friendly environment. If his conception under a love potion truly left him incapable of love, as Rowling suggested, then all the Gryffindor friendship and warmth in the world won't change that fundamental deficit. He might learn to value his housemates in his own way. He might develop something resembling loyalty or protectiveness. But the deep human connections that truly change people, that make them willing to sacrifice themselves for others, might always be beyond his reach. And what about Tom's obsession with power? Gryffindor has produced powerful wizards, certainly, but Gryffindor values don't glorify power for its own sake. They emphasize using your strength to protect others, to fight for what's right, to stand against injustice. For Tom, who sees power as the solution to vulnerability, as protection against a cruel world, this distinction might not resonate. He might simply learn to frame his pursuit of power in different terms, to justify it as being necessary to protect others or fight dark forces, when really it's still about his own security and supremacy. Here's a darker possibility. What if Gryffindor Tom Riddle became a different kind of threat? Instead of becoming a Dark Lord who divided the wizarding world along blood purity lines, what if he became a charismatic leader who believed he was doing good? History is full of people who committed atrocities while genuinely believing they were heroes. If Tom learned to cloak his desire for power in Gryffindor's language of courage and righteousness, if he believed he was protecting the wizarding world or fighting for justice, he could be even more dangerous than the Voldemort we know, because people follow heroes more readily than they follow obvious villains. Imagine a Tom Riddle who never becomes Voldemort, never creates Horcruxes, never divides his soul, but still becomes Minister for Magic in his 30s, beloved by the public, seen as a brilliant and brave leader, and then uses that position to slowly, methodically expand his own power, to eliminate threats and opposition, all while maintaining his heroic image. He might never call himself a Dark Lord, might never gather Death Eaters or start a war, but he could still reshape the wizarding world according to his vision, could still impose his will on others, could still cause tremendous harm, just through legitimate channels, with popular support, believing himself to be the hero of the story. This is perhaps the most chilling version of this alternate timeline. Not that Tom Riddle becomes good, but that he becomes a villain who thinks he's a hero. Because Gryffindor doesn't just produce heroes. It produces people who believe in fighting for what they think is right, even unto death. And if Tom Riddle believed that his vision was right, that his rule was necessary, that opposition to him was a threat to the greater good, then Gryffindor courage would make him absolutely unstoppable. But let's explore the more optimistic possibilities too, because that's part of the fascination with these alternate timelines. What if the environment really could make a difference? What if 7 years of being surrounded by people who modeled genuine courage, loyalty, and selflessness actually did shape Tom in positive ways? Consider that Tom Riddle was a product of his circumstances. He never knew love, never had a family, never experienced unconditional acceptance. Every relationship he formed was transactional. At the orphanage, he had to fight for everything. Other children were competitors or victims, never friends. The adults were either oblivious to his true nature or afraid of him. When he discovered he was a wizard, it must have felt like validation. He wasn't just a weird, frightening child. He was special. He was powerful. Magic was his ticket out of that miserable existence. If Hogwarts, specifically Gryffindor, had offered him something different, a genuine sense of belonging, might that have changed his trajectory? Humans are social creatures, even those with psychological issues. We're shaped by our tribes, our communities, our sense of connection to others. If Tom had found a tribe in Gryffindor, if he had experienced what it felt like to be part of something bigger than himself, it might have given him something to protect, rather than something to dominate. There's a beautiful theory in psychology about how even people with antisocial personality disorder can develop something resembling prosocial behavior if they're in the right environment, with the right incentives. They might not feel empathy the way others do, but they can learn to value their community because it benefits them, because protecting and supporting their group serves their own interests. Tom Riddle was brilliant enough to understand that cooperation can be more effective than domination. That loyalty earned through genuine leadership is more powerful than loyalty extracted through fear. If Tom had stayed in Gryffindor, if he had risen to become head boy not through manipulation but through genuinely earning the respect of his peers, if he had learned that being part of something meaningful was more satisfying than standing alone at the top of a hierarchy built on terror, perhaps his ambition would have taken a different form. Perhaps he would have still pursued power, but as a leader who lifted others up rather than crushing them. Perhaps his determination to never be vulnerable again would have manifested as building strong alliances and communities rather than hiding pieces of his soul in cursed objects. Let's talk about the impact. on the broader wizarding world if Voldemort had never existed? This is where the ripple effects become enormous. Tom Riddle, in the original timeline, didn't just become a Dark Lord. He created a movement that defined wizarding politics for half a century. The First Wizarding War, his initial reign of terror, shaped an entire generation. Then his downfall created a power vacuum and a period of paranoia where former Death Eaters claimed they'd been under the Imperious Curse. And finally, his return sparked the Second Wizarding War, which culminated in the Battle of Hogwarts. Without Voldemort, none of this happens. Literally thousands of lives are saved. The Potters survive. The Longbottoms are never tortured into insanity. The Prewett brothers, Marlene McKinnon, the Bones family, all the casualties of the First Wizarding War get to live full lives. Families aren't torn apart. Children don't grow up as orphans. The wizarding world doesn't descend into a dark age of fear and suspicion. But here's what's really interesting. Harry Potter is never born. James Potter and Lily Evans might still get together. They might still have a child. But that child wouldn't be Harry Potter, the boy who lived, marked as Voldemort's equal. Harry's entire identity, his entire purpose, was defined by Voldemort's attempt to kill him, and the protection his mother's sacrifice granted. Without Voldemort, there's no prophecy, no chosen one, no story as we know it. The prophecy itself is fascinating to consider in this context. You know the one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the seventh month dies. That prophecy was made about Voldemort specifically. If Tom Riddle had never become Voldemort, never risen as a Dark Lord, the prophecy would never have been made. But does that mean the universe would have course-corrected somehow? Is there some cosmic balance that demands a Dark Lord and a chosen one to oppose him? This gets into metaphysical territory that we can't really answer, but it's worth considering. The Harry Potter universe seems to have genuine prophecy, genuine divination that can predict future events. If Tom Riddle had been sorted into Gryffindor and never become Voldemort, would someone else have risen to become that Dark Lord? Would another candidate for ultimate evil have emerged to fulfill the universe's apparent need for a great conflict? It's possible that without Tom Riddle becoming Voldemort, Gellert Grindelwald's reign would have been different. In our original timeline, Grindelwald was defeated by Dumbledore in 1945, well before Tom Riddle graduated from Hogwarts. But what if Dumbledore had been distracted by his efforts to mentor and guide Tom, and had delayed his confrontation with Grindelwald? Or conversely, what if having Tom as an ally, a brilliant young wizard who had been shaped by Gryffindor values, had made Dumbledore more effective in fighting Grindelwald? These are the kinds of butterfly effects that make alternate timelines so complex. Let's think about the Death Eaters, or rather, the students who would have become Death Eaters. Abraxas Malfoy, Antonin Dolohov, Avery, Lestrange, Nott, and others who were at Hogwarts with Tom and fell under his influence. Without Tom to lead them, to give them purpose and direction, would they have simply remained unpleasant pure-blood supremacists but never escalated to terrorism and murder? The Death Eaters weren't just a random collection of dark wizards. They were specifically Tom Riddle's creation, molded by his charisma and his vision. Some of them might have found other ways to express their prejudices. The wizarding world clearly had issues with blood purity and Muggle relations long before Voldemort. But there's a difference between social prejudice and organized violence. Tom Riddle gave the pureblood supremacy movement teeth. He transformed it from a set of distasteful attitudes into an actual war. Without him, the wizarding world might have simply continued along its problematic but not actively murderous path, slowly evolving toward greater equality without the catalyst of a violent conflict to force the change. This raises an uncomfortable question. Would the wizarding world actually be better off without having faced Voldemort? Would the complacency and prejudices of wizarding society have persisted longer without the crisis that forced people to examine their values and choose sides? Sometimes societies need to be shaken to their foundations to achieve real change. Voldemort was a monster, but the fight against him also created heroes, united people across blood status and house lines, and ultimately led to a more just wizarding world. If Tom Riddle had been in Gryffindor and never become Voldemort, the wizarding world might have been more peaceful, but also more stagnant. The systemic issues that Voldemort exploited, the prejudices he amplified, might have festered longer. Or perhaps a Gryffindor Tom Riddle might have been the one to lead positive change, to use his brilliance and charisma to push for reform and greater equality. That's actually a fascinating possibility. Tom Riddle as a force for social progress, using his understanding of pure-blood society's thinking to dismantle it from within, championing Muggle-born rights not out of compassion but out of a Gryffindor sense of justice. Here's what we need to understand about Tom Riddle. He had the capacity to be extraordinary no matter what path he took. His intelligence, his magical ability, his determination, these were going to make him significant one way or another. The question isn't whether Tom Riddle would have been important, but rather what kind of important he would have been. In Slytherin, surrounded by enablers and encouraged in his worst impulses, he became history's greatest dark wizard. In Gryffindor, shaped by different values and expectations, he might have become history's greatest reformer or most effective minister for magic, or most brilliant magical theorist. Let's imagine Tom Riddle's career after Hogwarts in this alternate timeline. In the original story, Tom wanted to teach defense against the dark arts at Hogwarts, but Dumbledore refused him, seeing through his innocent request to his true dark intentions. Tom then disappeared for years, traveling the world, diving into the darkest magic, gathering followers, and eventually returning as Lord Voldemort. But if Tom had been a Gryffindor, if he had proven himself over 7 years to be trustworthy, might Dumbledore have given him that teaching position? Imagine Professor Tom Riddle, youngest Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher in Hogwarts history, brilliant and demanding but genuinely invested in preparing his students to face dark forces. He would have been an incredible teacher because Tom always excelled at anything he set his mind to. His classes would be challenging, a bit frightening perhaps, but students would learn more from him than from any other defense professor. And being a teacher at Hogwarts would give Tom something he never had: a stable home, a community, a sense of purpose beyond his own advancement. Teaching is transformative, not just for students but for teachers themselves. When you're responsible for shaping young minds, when you see your students grow and succeed, it creates a different relationship with the world. Tom might have found satisfaction in being the teacher he never had, in guiding students who, like him, came from difficult backgrounds or struggled with being different. He might have been particularly good with Slytherin students, understanding their ambitions and showing them how to channel those drives toward positive ends. Or perhaps Tom would have gone into the Ministry of Magic, joining the Department of Magical Law Enforcement or even the Auror Office. A Gryffindor Tom Riddle, with his intelligence and magical skill, would have been an obvious candidate for fighting dark wizards. The irony of Tom Riddle as an Auror, hunting down the kinds of dark wizards he would have become in another timeline, is almost too perfect. He would have been frighteningly effective at it too, because he understands how dark wizards think, what motivates them, what they're capable of. As an Auror, Tom might have been a bit ruthless, a bit too willing to use aggressive tactics, but ultimately on the side of justice. He could have risen through the ranks, eventually becoming head of the Auror Office, then perhaps Minister for Magic himself. And here we come back to that question of whether Tom could ever really be trusted with ultimate power. Even a Gryffindor Tom Riddle, shaped by years of positive influences, would still have that fundamental drive for control, that fear of vulnerability, that belief that he knows better than others. The question of Tom's fear of death remains central to his character, house placement aside. In the original timeline, this fear drove him to create Horcruxes, to split his soul in pursuit of immortality. The question is whether Gryffindor values would give him a different framework for dealing with this fear. Gryffindors aren't fearless. They feel fear just like everyone else. But they've been taught that some things are worth dying for, that courage means acting despite fear, that accepting death is part of accepting life. Would Tom buy into this philosophy? That's hard to say. His fear of death wasn't just abstract. It was rooted in his traumatic childhood, in watching his mother die, in growing up surrounded by death and loss with no one to comfort him. That kind of deep-seated fear doesn't just go away because you're told to be brave. But perhaps if Tom had found things worth living for beyond just his own survival, his relationship with death might have shifted. If he had students he cared about mentoring, or colleagues he respected, or even something resembling friends, the idea of his own death might be less about his personal annihilation and more about leaving behind a legacy. Gryffindor is the house that has produced wizards and witches willing to die for what they believe in. James Potter died protecting his family. Lily Potter died to save her son. Sirius Black died fighting Death Eaters. Even Harry Potter was willing to walk to his own death to save others. This is the house culture Tom would have been immersed in. He would have seen, again and again, examples of people who chose something over their own survival. He would have been taught that this was admirable, heroic, the highest form of courage. Now Tom might have found this alien and even contemptible, or he might have, over time, come to understand it intellectually, even if he couldn't feel it emotionally. He might have developed a philosophy that while he personally feared death, he could respect those who didn't, and that protecting the ability of others to make that choice was itself valuable. This would be a very Tom Riddle way of engaging with Gryffindor values, understanding them as an outsider, appreciating them intellectually, and finding ways to align his actions with them, even if his motivations remained fundamentally self-interested. What about Tom's discovery of his heritage? In the original timeline, learning that he was the heir of Slytherin was transformative for Tom. It gave him an identity, a legacy, proof that he wasn't just an orphan, but someone special. He rejected the name Tom Riddle, the name he shared with his Muggle father, and created the anagram Lord Voldemort from his full name. He embraced his connection to Salazar Slytherin and built his entire ideology around pure blood supremacy and wizard superiority. In Gryffindor, Tom would still discover his heritage. He would still learn about his mother's family, the Gaunts, and their descent from Slytherin. But the meaning of this discovery would be different. In a house that doesn't value blood purity or ancient lineages, that celebrates Muggle-borns like Hermione Granger and half-bloods like Harry Potter, Tom's connection to Slytherin might be interesting but not defining. It might be like discovering you're related to a historical figure, cool to know, but not necessarily shaping your entire identity. Tom might actually be embarrassed by his connection to Slytherin if he'd internalized Gryffindor values. Salazar Slytherin, after all, was the founder who left Hogwarts because he thought Muggle-borns shouldn't be taught magic. He built the Chamber of Secrets to house a monster meant to purge the school of those he deemed unworthy. From a Gryffindor perspective, Slytherin is the villain of Hogwarts' founding story. Learning you're his descendant might be more burden than blessing. On the other hand, Tom being Tom, he might see it as an opportunity to redeem that legacy. To be the heir of Slytherin who rejected his ancestors' prejudices, who proved that blood doesn't determine worth or character. That would be a very Gryffindor thing to do, actually. To take a dark legacy and transform it into something positive. Tom could become famous for being the heir of Slytherin who chose a different path, who used his understanding of pure blood culture to fight against its worst elements. Let's consider one more crucial aspect of Tom's character, his relationship with power and how he views other people. In the original timeline, Tom saw people as tools or obstacles. He didn't form genuine relationships. He cultivated useful connections. He didn't have friends. He had followers. Even his closest Death Eaters were expendable to him. He valued people only for what they could do for him, and he felt no guilt about using them or disposing of them when they were no longer useful. This utilitarian view of human relationships is sociopathic, and it's unclear whether any amount of positive environment could change it. But behavior can change even when underlying psychology doesn't. If Tom spent 7 years watching genuine friendship, seeing people sacrifice for each other not out of manipulation but out of care, observing the strength that comes from authentic connection, he might learn to mimic these behaviors even if he doesn't truly feel them. And over time, behaviors can become habits, and habits can shape identity. There's actually psychological research suggesting that acting as if you feel certain emotions can, over time, help generate those emotions. It's not that you're faking it until you make it exactly, but rather that your brain begins to rewire itself based on your behaviors. If Tom spent years acting like a loyal friend, defending his housemates, celebrating their successes, supporting them through difficulties, the neural pathways associated with these behaviors would strengthen. He might never feel emotions the way others do, but he might develop something approximating care or loyalty, at least toward specific individuals. The person most likely to benefit from Tom's approximation of loyalty would probably be Dumbledore. In the original timeline, Dumbledore represented everything Tom resented: authority, judgment, someone who couldn't be fooled or controlled. But in a Gryffindor timeline with Dumbledore actively mentoring Tom, their relationship could be the cornerstone of Tom's development. Dumbledore could become the father figure Tom never had, not in an emotional sense necessarily, but as a guiding influence, a model of what power with wisdom looks like. Dumbledore himself had to learn hard lessons about power and ambition. His friendship with Grindelwald, his plans for wizard supremacy, his sister's death, all of these experiences taught Dumbledore that power without compassion and wisdom leads to tragedy. He spent the rest of his life trying to prevent others from making his mistakes. Imagine how invested Dumbledore would be in guiding Tom Riddle away from that same precipice. He would see in Tom not just potential for darkness, but potential for greatness if properly guided, and Tom, for his part, might actually respect Dumbledore in this timeline, not as an obstacle to overcome, but as someone worth learning from. Dumbledore was arguably the most powerful wizard of his age, yet he chose to remain a teacher rather than seeking political power. He turned down the position of Minister for Magic multiple times. This restraint, this choice of wisdom over power, might intrigue Tom. He might not understand it emotionally, but he could recognize it as a form of strength he hadn't considered. Their relationship could become something like that between a master and apprentice, with Dumbledore teaching Tom not just magic but philosophy, ethics, the responsibilities that come with great power. Tom would probably chafe against some of these lessons, might secretly think Dumbledore was too soft or too idealistic, but the seeds would be planted, and when Tom eventually faced choices about how to use his power, Dumbledore's teachings would be in his mind, offering an alternative to his first instincts. Now let's address something we haven't fully explored yet. What would Tom Riddle look like physically in this alternate timeline? In the original story, Tom's creation of Horcruxes warped him physically. Each time he split his soul, he lost more of his humanity, until eventually he became the snake-like, inhuman creature we know as Voldemort. His red eyes, his flat nose, his pale skin, his inhuman appearance reflected the destruction of his soul. If Tom never created Horcruxes, if he never pursued immortality through dark magic, he would remain handsome. The young Tom Riddle was described as extraordinarily good-looking, with his mother's delicate features and a charisma that drew people to him. An older Tom Riddle, shaped by Gryffindor and avoiding the darkest magic, might age into distinguished handsomeness. He would look human. He would look trustworthy. And this, in some ways, could make him more dangerous than Voldemort ever was. Voldemort's monstrous appearance was useful propaganda for his enemies. It was easy to paint him as evil when he looked like a monster. But a handsome, charismatic Tom Riddle, Minister for Magic or Headmaster of Hogwarts, with his charming smile and apparent nobility of purpose, that Tom could get away with far more before anyone realized what he was doing. Physical appearance matters in how we perceive people, and a human-looking Tom would have enormous advantages over snake-faced Voldemort. This brings us to perhaps the most important question of this entire exploration. Is there a timeline where Tom Riddle becomes genuinely good? Not just non-evil, not just neutral or controlled, but actually good? Can someone with his psychological makeup, his childhood trauma, his inherent difficulties with empathy and emotional connection, become a truly virtuous person? The optimistic answer is that goodness isn't about feelings. It's about choices. You don't have to feel empathy to choose not to harm others. You don't have to experience love to decide that protecting people is worthwhile. Many ethical philosophers have argued that morality is fundamentally about rational choice, not emotional response. If Tom Riddle, through years in Gryffindor, came to rationally believe that cooperation is superior to domination, that building is better than destroying, that a rising tide lifts all boats, he could make ethical choices consistently, even without the emotional drivers that motivate most people. This wouldn't make him a warm person. He wouldn't be someone you'd want to have deep emotional conversations with. He might remain somewhat cold, calculating, driven by logic rather than feeling, but he could still be a force for good in the world. He could fight dark wizards, reform unjust systems, protect the vulnerable, mentor students, contribute to magical knowledge, and leave the world better than he found it. All without ever feeling the emotions that usually motivate such actions. The pessimistic answer is that Tom Riddle's core issues are too severe, too deeply rooted, for any environment to fully overcome. That someone born unable to love, raised in trauma and isolation, displaying sociopathic tendencies from early childhood, has fundamental deficits that can't be repaired by putting them in a nicer house at boarding school. That Tom would always be capable of monstrous actions if he believed they served his purposes. that his charm and intelligence would just help him hide his true nature better, that Gryffindor would give him a better mask to wear, but wouldn't change what's underneath. The realistic answer is probably somewhere in between. Tom Riddle would never be Harry Potter. He would never sacrifice himself for others out of love. He would never form the kind of deep, genuine friendships that the main trio shares. He would always be somewhat apart, somewhat other, someone who understands virtue intellectually but doesn't feel it in his bones. But he could still choose to align himself with good rather than evil. He could still decide that being constructive serves his interests better than being destructive. He could still become someone who makes the world better, even if his motivations for doing so are fundamentally self-interested. And maybe that's enough. Maybe we don't need everyone to be a saint. Maybe it's sufficient if people choose not to hurt others, choose to contribute positively to society, choose to use their talents for building rather than destroying, regardless of their inner emotional landscape. Tom Riddle would never be the hero of the story in the way Harry is. But he could be a complex, morally ambiguous character who ultimately lands on the right side of history, who uses his considerable gifts for positive ends, who proves that your house, your choices, and your actions matter more than your innate psychological limitations. So, what if Voldemort had been sorted into Gryffindor? The most likely outcome is that Tom Riddle wouldn't have become Voldemort at all. The specific confluence of factors that created history's darkest wizard would have been disrupted. Tom would still be brilliant, ambitious, and psychologically complicated. He would still have issues with empathy, attachment, and his fear of death. But he wouldn't have been validated and enabled in his worst impulses. He wouldn't have gathered followers who encouraged his darkest ideas. He wouldn't have built his identity around pure-blood supremacy and the rejection of his Muggle heritage. Instead, Tom would have been shaped by 7 years of Gryffindor values, by housemates who modeled courage and loyalty, by teachers who tried to guide him toward using his gifts responsibly. He might have become Minister for Magic, or Headmaster of Hogwarts, or the greatest Auror of his generation. He might have been a force for reform in wizarding society, using his understanding of pure blood culture to dismantle it from within. He might have been a bit ruthless, a bit too pragmatic, someone people respected more than they loved. But he wouldn't have been a monster. The wizarding world would be unrecognizably different. Thousands of people who died in the wars would be alive. Families would be intact. Harry Potter as we know him wouldn't exist, but neither would all the trauma and loss that defined his generation. The trade-off would be a more peaceful but perhaps more complacent wizarding society, one that hadn't been forced by Voldemort's rise to confront its prejudices and injustices. And Tom Riddle himself? He would be a fascinating figure in this alternate history. Not a hero, not a villain, but something more complex. A brilliant wizard with a dark past and inner demons he never quite conquered, who nevertheless chose to align himself with the light. Who proved that your Hogwarts house, your choices, and the community that shapes you can make all the difference. Who demonstrated that you don't need to be capable of love to still choose not to become a monster. The Sorting Hat in this timeline would have been vindicated. Its controversial decision to put Tom Riddle in Gryffindor, to bet on his capacity for courage over his ambition and cunning, would have literally changed the course of wizarding history. It would have proven that the hat doesn't just sort based on who you are, but who you could become, and that sometimes placing someone in the house that will challenge them rather than the house that will comfort them is exactly the right choice. This alternate timeline reminds us of one of the central themes of the Harry Potter series, that our choices matter more than our abilities. Tom Riddle and Harry Potter were remarkably similar in many ways. Both were orphans. Both spoke Parseltongue. Both were powerful, brilliant, determined. The Sorting Hat even considered putting Harry in Slytherin. But Harry's choices, the influences that shaped him, the love he received and gave, made him the hero of the story. Tom's different choices, shaped by different influences, made him the villain. But let's dive even deeper into what Tom's life in Gryffindor would actually look like on a day-to-day basis, because it's in these small moments that character is truly formed. Imagine Tom's first breakfast in the Great Hall as a Gryffindor. He sits down at the table, still processing the shock of his sorting, and immediately someone passes him the bacon without him having to ask. Someone else is excitedly telling a story about their summer, including him in the conversation as if he already belongs. At the orphanage, meals were competitive, sometimes aggressive affairs where you had to fight for your share. Here, there's abundance and sharing. It's such a small thing, But for a boy who has never experienced casual generosity, it would be significant. Tom's first week would be full of these micro-moments that challenge his worldview. A housemate offers to show him the best route to the greenhouses. Another helps him figure out the moving staircases without being asked. Someone invites him to study together even though Tom clearly doesn't need help with his coursework. These aren't calculated moves. They're just what Gryffindors do for each other. And Tom, who has spent his entire life believing that every interaction is a power play, would be confused. He'd look for the angle, the hidden agenda, and find none. Initially, Tom might find this weakness. All these Gryffindors helping each other, trusting each other, sharing resources without demanding anything in return. Don't they understand that this makes them vulnerable? That someone could exploit this openness? But as weeks turn into months, he'd also notice something else. The Gryffindors are strong precisely because of this mutual support. When one of them struggles, the others lift them up. When they face challenges, they face them together. There's a resilience in their unity that Tom, for all his individual power, has never possessed. Let's think about Tom's first flying lesson, which in the original timeline would have been just another opportunity for him to excel and show off. In Gryffindor, the dynamic would be different. Yes, Tom would still be naturally talented, picking up flying quickly because he's gifted at everything he tries. But when he notices a housemate struggling, maybe someone afraid of heights or uncoordinated on a broom, the Gryffindor culture would expect him to help. Not to mock, not to use their weakness against them later, but to genuinely assist them. Tom's first instinct might be to refuse. Why should he waste his time on someone else's inadequacy? But he'd see other Gryffindors helping without hesitation, and he'd understand that refusing would mark him as different, as not really one of them. So he'd help grudgingly at first, and maybe, just maybe, when that student finally manages to hover steadily and thanks Tom with genuine gratitude, something small would shift inside him. Not empathy, not exactly, but a recognition that helping others doesn't diminish his own power. It might even enhance it, because now that student is grateful, loyal, an ally rather than a potential enemy. Tom's academic brilliance would still shine through regardless of his house. He'd still be the student who masters spells on the first try, who reads ahead in textbooks, who asks questions that make professors pause and think. But in Gryffindor, this brilliance would be channeled differently. Instead of using his knowledge to manipulate or intimidate, he'd find that sharing information earns him respect and friendship. When he explains a difficult concept to struggling housemates, he's not being weak. He's being strong in a different way, the kind of strength that Gryffindors value. Consider Tom's relationship with Quidditch in this timeline. In Slytherin, Tom didn't play Quidditch in the original story. He saw it as beneath him, a waste of time that could be spent on more important magical studies. But in Gryffindor, where Quidditch is practically a religion, where house pride centers around the team, refusing to engage with it would set him apart. Tom might initially resist, seeing sports as trivial. But he'd also recognize that Quidditch is where Gryffindor bonds, where house unity is forged. If Tom became a seeker, and he would be excellent at it because Tom is excellent at everything, it would teach him something valuable about working within a team structure. Yes, the seeker gets glory for catching the snitch, but you can't win without your chasers scoring goals, your beaters protecting the team, your keeper defending the hoops. Tom would have to learn to trust others, to coordinate with them, to accept that he can't control every aspect of the game. These would be difficult lessons for someone who always wants total control, but they'd be important ones. Imagine Tom making a spectacular catch to win a match against Slytherin, and the entire Gryffindor house erupting in celebration, lifting him onto their shoulders, chanting his name. For someone who has never felt unconditional acceptance, never experienced being celebrated just for being part of a group, this would be intoxicating. Not in a dark way, but in a way that shows him what belonging feels like. He might become somewhat addicted to that feeling, to being the hero that brings glory to his house. And channeling his need for recognition into sporting achievement is infinitely better than channeling it into dark magic. Let's explore Tom's relationship with specific Gryffindor students in more detail. He needs a friend, a real friend, someone who breaks through his walls whether he wants them to or not. Let's call this hypothetical student Marcus. Marcus is a pure-blood Gryffindor, maybe from a minor noble family, someone with enough confidence not to be intimidated by Tom, but without the arrogance that would put Tom on the defensive. Marcus would be the kind of person who decides they're going to be friends with Tom and simply refuses to take no for an answer. At first, Tom would find Marcus annoying. Marcus sits next to him at meals even when Tom clearly wants to be alone. Marcus includes Tom in conversations even when Tom gives short, discouraging answers. Marcus invites Tom to join study groups, to play wizard's chess, to explore the castle, completely impervious to Tom's cool reception. But Marcus isn't stupid. He's a Gryffindor, which means he's perceptive about people in his own way. He sees that Tom is brilliant but lonely, powerful but isolated. And Marcus, with typical Gryffindor determination, decides that Tom needs a friend even if Tom doesn't know it yet. Gradually, despite himself, Tom would start responding. Maybe it begins with wizard's chess, because that's something Tom can approach analytically, a competition he can engage in without emotional vulnerability. Tom would win most games because he's better at strategy, but Marcus would be a good enough player to make it interesting. And during those games, they'd talk. Not about feelings or personal things at first, but about classes, about professors, about magical theory. Safe topics that slowly build a foundation of interaction. Over time, Marcus would learn Tom's tells. He'd know when Tom is actually angry versus when he's just being prickly out of habit. He'd understand that Tom's silence doesn't always mean disinterest. Sometimes it means he's processing something. He'd figure out that Tom responds better to challenges than to sympathy, that appealing to his intelligence is more effective than appealing to his emotions. And Marcus would adapt his approach accordingly, not because he's manipulating Tom, but because that's what friends do. They learn each other's languages. The turning point in their friendship might come during a crisis. Perhaps Marcus gets into serious trouble. Maybe he's caught somewhere he shouldn't be or accused of something he didn't do, and he's facing severe punishment or even expulsion. Tom, who by this point has spent several years learning to care about Marcus in his limited way, would have a choice. He could stay out of it, protect himself, let Marcus face the consequences alone, or he could help, even if it means taking a risk, even if it means revealing some of his own secrets or abilities. In the original timeline, Tom would have calculated whether Marcus was useful enough to be worth the risk. In the Gryffindor timeline, having been shaped by years of watching people help each other without calculating the return, Tom might surprise himself by choosing to help. Not because of overwhelming compassion, but because Marcus is his friend, and that means something now. It means loyalty, even the limited kind of loyalty Tom is capable of. This moment would be crucial because it would prove to Tom that he's changed, that Gryffindor has actually affected him at a fundamental level. Now let's talk about Tom's interactions with female students, because this is an aspect of his character that's often overlooked. In the original timeline, Tom was described as having admirers, girls who were drawn to his good looks and charisma. But there's no indication he ever had a genuine romantic relationship or even close friendships with girls. He used his attractiveness as a tool, manipulating people when needed, but never forming real connections. In Gryffindor, Tom would encounter girls like Hermione Granger types, brilliant witches who wouldn't be impressed by looks alone. They'd want intellectual engagement, genuine respect, real conversation. Tom, who is highly intelligent and capable of sophisticated discussion, could actually connect with these kinds of people on an intellectual level. He might develop a friendship with a particularly gifted witch in his year, someone he respects for her magical ability and theoretical knowledge. This friendship would be important because it would teach Tom that women are people, not just tools or admirers. In Gryffindor, where students are valued for their courage and character rather than their blood status or political connections, Tom would be surrounded by strong, capable witches who demand to be treated as equals. He'd learn that respecting women isn't just politically correct, it's practically necessary if you want to succeed in Gryffindor. And over time, these interactions would shape how he views half the population, giving him a more balanced perspective than Slytherin's often sexist culture would have provided. Could Tom fall in love in this timeline? That's a difficult question given Rowling's statement about his conception under a love potion leaving him unable to love. But perhaps he could develop something resembling romantic attachment, even if it doesn't feel like what others experience as love. He might find a partner who understands his limitations, someone intellectual enough to appreciate his mind, and independent enough not to need constant emotional reassurance. It wouldn't be a fairy tale romance. but it could be a functional, mutually beneficial partnership that gives Tom another anchor to the light. Let's discuss Tom's education in more specific detail, particularly his approach to defense against the dark arts, which was always his passion. In both timelines, Tom would be fascinated by this subject. But in Gryffindor, his professors would frame it differently. Instead of just teaching the mechanics of dark magic and its counters, a good defense professor would emphasize why we defend, what we're protecting, who we're protecting. They'd teach that defense isn't just about power, it's about responsibility, about standing between innocent people and harm. Tom would excel in practical defense lessons. His dueling skills would be extraordinary, his reflexes perfect, his spell selection strategic and effective. But here's what would be different. In practice duels with his housemates, he'd have to hold back. You don't actually hurt your friends when you're training together. You help them improve. You point out their weaknesses so they can fix them, not to humiliate them but to make them stronger. This restraint, this calibrated use of power, would be excellent training for Tom. It would teach him that having power and choosing not to use it fully is its own form of strength. Imagine Tom becoming the student that younger Gryffindors seek out for defense tutoring. He's patient in his way, not warm but clear and effective. He can explain complex defensive magic in terms anyone can understand. He pushes students to their limits but doesn't break them. And here's the key, he finds satisfaction in this. Not the warm, fuzzy satisfaction of altruism, but the intellectual satisfaction of seeing someone understand something he taught them, the practical satisfaction of knowing he's making his house stronger, the personal satisfaction of being needed and valued. When Tom studies dark magic, and he would absolutely study it because he's curious about everything, the context would matter. In Slytherin, studying dark magic is about power, about learning weapons you might use. In Gryffindor, studying dark magic is about understanding your enemy, knowing what you're up against so you can better protect people. It's the same knowledge applied with different intent. Tom would still learn about Horcruxes, about the darkest spells, about all the terrible things magic can do, but he'd be learning them as someone training to fight dark wizards, not to become one. This brings us to a crucial moment, when Tom discovers Horcruxes. In the original timeline, he sought out information about them from Professor Slughorn, asking seemingly innocent questions about what would happen if someone split their soul into 7 pieces. Slughorn, horrified, tried to suppress the memory afterward. But Tom got enough information to later create 6 Horcruxes, splitting his soul and ensuring his immortality at the cost of his humanity. In the Gryffindor timeline, this interaction might go very differently. Tom would still be fascinated by the concept of Horcruxes because they represent a solution to his greatest fear, death. But imagine he's also been shaped by years of Gryffindor values, years of Dumbledore's mentorship. When he discovers what creating a Horcrux requires, the murder and the soul splitting, he might be repulsed in a way original. Tom wasn't. Not because he's developed empathy for murder victims, but because he's been taught that integrity matters, that wholeness is strength, that fragmenting yourself is the ultimate weakness. Gryffindor. Tom might research Horcruxes academically, understanding how they work and why they're considered the darkest of dark magic, but ultimately reject them as a solution. He might recognize that pursuing immortality through soul splitting would make him into exactly the kind of dark wizard he's supposed to fight against. It would mean betraying everything Gryffindor stands for, disappointing Dumbledore, losing the respect of his housemates. And by this point in his education, those things might matter enough to make him choose differently, but his fear of death would still need an outlet. Perhaps Tom would throw himself into studying other forms of magical longevity. Nicholas Flamel's Philosopher's Stone, for instance. Ancient wizards who lived for centuries through various means. Magical healing and life extension that doesn't require murder or soul splitting. Tom could become obsessed with extending life through legitimate magical research, making genuine contributions to magical medicine and theory in the process. This would satisfy his need to conquer death while keeping him on the right side of that crucial moral line. Let's explore what happens when Tom faces real darkness as a student. Because Hogwarts isn't perfectly safe, even in the best of times. There are dangerous creatures in the Forbidden Forest. There are dark objects hidden in the castle. There are occasional threats that students might encounter. Imagine a scenario where Tom and a group of his housemates encounter something genuinely dangerous. Maybe during an unauthorized exploration of the castle, or a mishap during a school trip. In this moment of real danger, Tom's training and instincts would kick in. He'd be the one who stays calm, who formulates a plan, who defends his friends with decisive action. This would be Tom at his best, powerful, controlled, protective. His housemates would see him standing between them and the threat, casting defensive spells with precision and power, absolutely fearless in the face of danger. And afterward, they'd be grateful, impressed, bonded to him through shared peril. This experience would be formative for Tom because it would show him that his power has purpose beyond his own advancement. He saved his friends not because it benefited him strategically, but because they were his friends and they needed saving. The rush of that moment, the clarity of purpose, the satisfaction of using his abilities for protection rather than domination, might give Tom a taste of what it feels like to be genuinely heroic. And that taste might be addictive in the best possible way. As Tom gets older, approaching his final years at Hogwarts, he'd need to think about his future. In the original timeline, he wanted to teach defense against the dark arts, but also to stay at Hogwarts where he felt powerful and safe. When Dumbledore denied him the position, seeing through his innocent facade to the darkness beneath, Tom left to pursue his dark education abroad. But in the Gryffindor timeline, if Dumbledore saw a Tom who had genuinely been shaped by positive influences, who had proven himself over 7 years, the interaction would be completely different. Picture this conversation. Tom, now 17 and about to graduate, requesting a meeting with Headmaster Dumbledore. Not to apply for the defense position, not yet, but to discuss his future. Tom respects Dumbledore too much by this point to go behind his back or to manipulate him. Instead, he's honest. He tells Dumbledore he wants to fight dark wizards, that he wants to make the world safer, but he's not sure how best to do that. Should he join the Auror office? Should he travel and study more magic first? Should he consider teaching eventually? Dumbledore, in this timeline, would see a young man who still has darkness in him, who still struggles with his demons, but who has consistently chosen the light for 7 years. Dumbledore would recognize that Tom will always be dangerous, that his power and intelligence make him someone who could tip toward darkness if the circumstances aligned badly. But Dumbledore would also see that Tom has been shaped by Gryffindor, that he's formed genuine connections, that he's learned to value things beyond his own survival and supremacy. Dumbledore's advice would be crucial here. He might suggest that Tom spend several years as an Auror first, putting his skills to practical use fighting actual dark wizards. This would give Tom an outlet for his aggressive tendencies, a legitimate target for his power, and a way to prove himself. It would also keep him in the Ministry's eye, which Dumbledore would consider important. Then, after Tom has matured further and proven himself in the field, they could revisit the teaching position. Tom would accept this advice, not because he's blindly obedient, but because he's learned to value Dumbledore's wisdom. He'd join the Auror office after graduation, and he'd be extraordinary at it. Tom Riddle as an Auror would be the Ministry's most effective dark wizard hunter. He'd understand how dark wizards think because part of him still thinks that way. He'd anticipate their strategies, counter their magic, track them relentlessly. He'd be ruthless within the bounds of the law, pushing right up against the line of acceptable force but never quite crossing it. His Auror career would give us some fascinating scenarios. Imagine Tom tracking a dark wizard through Eastern Europe, someone using forbidden magic to terrorize Muggle villages. Tom catches up to him in a ruined castle and they duel. Tom is clearly superior, disarming his opponent efficiently. The dark wizard is at his mercy, and for a moment Tom has a choice. The easy thing would be to kill him, to eliminate the threat permanently. The legal thing is to bring him in for trial. Original Tom Riddle would kill without hesitation. Gryffindor Tom, shaped by years of being taught that courage includes showing mercy, that strength includes restraint, that justice matters more than convenience, would choose to bring him in. It wouldn't be an easy choice. Part of Tom would want to kill, would recognize that this dark wizard will likely escape or be released eventually and hurt more people. But Tom would remember his training, his values, what Dumbledore taught him, and he'd make the harder choice. Over time, Tom would build a reputation as the Auror you sent for impossible cases, the one who always got his target, the one who never lost a duel, but also as someone cold, intense, hard to work with. His partners would respect his abilities, but find him difficult personally. He wouldn't socialize much with other Aurors, wouldn't attend their gatherings or joke around during downtime. He'd remain somewhat isolated because that's his nature, But he'd be unquestionably on the right side, fighting for the light even if he remained a creature of shadows himself. Let's talk about what Tom discovers about his family in this timeline, because that's a crucial part of his journey. He'd still research his heritage, still trace his mother's line back to the Gaunts and to Salazar Slytherin. He'd still find his Uncle Morphin in the decrepit Gaunt shack, still learn about his Muggle father in Little Hangleton. But his reaction to this information would be filtered through his Gryffindor perspective. When Tom discovers his father abandoned his pregnant mother, leaving her to die alone, he'd still feel rage and betrayal. That's a universal response to parental abandonment. But instead of that rage turning into murderous hatred of all Muggles and a desperate need to distance himself from his Muggle heritage, Tom might channel it differently. He might recognize that his father was one terrible person, not a representative of all non-magical people. He might even develop a grim empathy for his mother, understanding that she too was a victim of circumstances and bad choices. The visit to the Gaunt shack would still be horrifying. Morphin, violent and deranged, living in squalor. The revelation that this is Tom's magical heritage, that he comes from this degraded line of pure-blood fanatics. In the original timeline, Tom killed his Muggle father and grandparents, framed Morphin for it, and used the murders to create his first Horcrux. It was his declaration of independence from both sides of his heritage, his statement that he was beyond blood status and family. In the Gryffindor timeline, Tom would still visit Little Hangleton. He might even confront his father, demanding answers about why he abandoned Tom's mother. But would he commit murder? By this point, Tom would be perhaps 19 or 20, an Auror with a promising career, someone who has spent years being shaped by Gryffindor values and Dumbledore's mentorship. He'd know that killing his father would mean becoming exactly what he's sworn to fight against. It would mean throwing away everything he's built, betraying everyone who believed in him. The confrontation might be brutal in other ways. Tom might tell his father exactly what happened to his mother, exactly what her abandonment led to. He might make it clear that he's powerful enough to destroy his father without breaking a sweat, but that he's choosing not to because he's better than that. It would be a moment of triumph over his worst instincts, proof that he's successfully integrated Gryffindor values. And walking away from that confrontation without committing violence would be one of the hardest things Tom ever does, but also one of the most important. What would Tom do about Morphin? In the original timeline, he framed his uncle for murder and left him to rot in Azkaban. In this timeline, as an Auror, Tom might actually help Morphin, not out of family loyalty exactly, but because it's his job to deal with dangerous wizards who need intervention. He might arrange for Morphin to be taken to St. Mungo's instead of Azkaban, to receive actual treatment for his clearly deteriorating mental state. It wouldn't be warm or compassionate, but it would be the right thing to do. And Tom would recognize that. As Tom moves through his 20s, his career advancing and his reputation growing, he'd face increasing pressure to take on more responsibility. The ministry would want him in leadership positions. The public would see him as a hero, the brilliant young Auror saving them from dark wizards. Marriage proposals would pour in from pure-blood families wanting to associate themselves with his success. And Tom would have to navigate all of this while managing his inner demons, his ongoing struggle with normal human emotions, his fear that he's one bad day away from becoming the monster he fights. This is where having mentors and friends becomes crucial. Dumbledore would still be there, checking in regularly, making sure Tom stays grounded. Marcus, assuming their friendship endured past Hogwarts, would be the person who reminds Tom to rest, to occasionally have fun, to remember that he's not just an Auror, but a human being. Maybe the intelligent witch he befriended in Gryffindor would be his colleague now. Someone who understands his struggles and doesn't judge him for his limitations. Tom's rise to head of the Auror office would be almost inevitable. By his early 30s, he'd have the experience, the skill, and the track record to justify the promotion. As department head, Tom would be terrifyingly effective. He'd reform Auror training to be more rigorous and practical. He'd develop new strategies for tracking and apprehending dark wizards. He'd build an elite force of specialists for the most dangerous cases. He'd also probably be strict to the point of harshness, demanding perfection and showing little patience for weakness or incompetence. But here's what would be different from Voldemort. Tom would be building something rather than destroying it. He'd be strengthening the institutions that protect people rather than tearing them down. His subordinates might find him difficult, might even fear him a little, but they'd also respect him enormously. They'd know that when Tom sends them on a mission, he's thoroughly planned it, considered every angle, prepared them as well as possible. They'd know he expects them to succeed, but also that he'll back them up if things go wrong. The question of Tom becoming Minister for Magic is inevitable. By his 40s, he'd be the obvious candidate. War hero, legendary auror, brilliant magical theorist, charismatic public speaker. The position would be his for the taking. But should he take it? This is where we see whether Gryffindor Tom has truly internalized his lessons about power and its uses. Dumbledore, probably ancient by this point but still alive and still watching, would have concerns about Tom becoming minister. Not because he thinks Tom would immediately become a tyrant, but because concentrated power is dangerous for anyone, especially for someone with Tom's particular psychology. Dumbledore might counsel Tom that he's more valuable as head of the Auror office, that his specific skills are better used there, that minister is a political position that would require compromises and machinations that might not suit Tom's direct approach. Tom might agree. This would be the ultimate test of his character development. In the original timeline, Tom sought the defense teaching position as a base of power at Hogwarts, and when denied, he left and eventually became Voldemort. He couldn't accept not being supreme, not being at the top. But Gryffindor Tom might recognize that Dumbledore is right, that taking the minister position would put him in a role where his worst tendencies might flourish. And he might, for perhaps the first time in his life, choose to accept limits on his ambition for the greater good. Or perhaps Tom would become minister, and the tension of the story would be watching whether he can handle that much power without being corrupted by it. He'd try to rule justly, to use his authority to genuinely improve the wizarding world. But there would always be temptations. The easy solution to a problem that happens to be illegal. The political enemy who would be simpler to eliminate than to outmaneuver. The growing frustration with people who don't understand what needs to be done, who block necessary changes out of stupidity or self-interest. Tom, as minister, would constantly be walking a tightrope between effective leadership and authoritarianism. He'd need his friends and mentors more than ever, people who could tell him when he was going too far, who could pull him back from the edge. And the story would be whether he'd listen to them, whether the values he learned in Gryffindor would hold even under the pressure of ultimate political power. Imagine a crisis during Tom's time as minister, perhaps a serious threat to the wizarding world from external forces, maybe Grindelwald's followers attempting a resurgence, or a new dark wizard rising somewhere else, or even a threat from the Muggle world that risks exposing wizarding society. Tom would have to make difficult decisions about how to respond. His instinct would be to act decisively and aggressively, to eliminate threats before they could fully materialize. But he'd also hear the voices of his advisors, of Dumbledore, of the public, urging restraint and due process. The test would be whether Tom could balance his natural inclination toward control with democratic values and the rule of law. Could he be a strong leader without becoming a dictator? Could he protect the wizarding world without trampling on individual rights and freedoms? This is where we'd see whether decades of living by Gryffindor values had truly changed him, or whether they were just a thin veneer over his darker nature. Let's consider Tom's personal life in his middle years. Would he marry? Would he have children? These questions matter because family would be another anchor keeping him connected to normal human existence. If Tom married someone strong and intelligent enough to be a genuine partner, someone who understood his limitations but also challenged him, that relationship could be transformative. Not in a romantic comedy way, but in providing him with a permanent stake in the future, a reason to care about the world beyond his own lifespan. Children would be even more significant. If Tom had a son or daughter, that child would represent both hope and danger. Hope, because caring for a child, even in Tom's limited way, would give him a direct investment in the future. He'd want the world to be safe for his child, which means maintaining the institutions and laws that protect people. Danger, because Tom might become obsessive about his child's safety and success, might try to control their life too tightly, might push them too hard to be perfect. Imagine Tom's child being sorted at Hogwarts. Would they be sorted into Gryffindor like their father, or into Slytherin like their ancestor Salazar? How Tom reacted to his child's sorting would reveal a lot about how much he'd changed. If his child went to Slytherin, would Tom be disappointed, worried, Or would he remember that the sorting hat sees potential, and that where you're sorted matters less than the choices you make? If he'd truly internalized Gryffindor's lessons, he'd support his child regardless of their house, understanding that each house has value. Tom as a father is a fascinating concept because it forces him to consider someone else's needs and well-being on a daily basis. He'd probably not be a warm father, not the type to give endless hugs and words of affirmation. But he could be a father who teaches, who protects, who sets high standards, and then helps his child meet them. He could be the father who makes sure his child is never as alone and vulnerable as he was, who uses his power to give his child the security and opportunities he never had. As Tom ages, assuming he lives a normal lifespan in this timeline without Horcruxes, he'd have to confront his greatest fear, death. This would be the ultimate test of whether Gryffindor had truly changed him. Gryffindor values say that some things are worth dying for, that accepting mortality is part of being human, that courage includes facing the end without trying to escape it. But Tom's fear of death is so deep, so fundamental to who he is. Could even decades of Gryffindor influence overcome it? Perhaps Tom would handle his mortality by focusing on legacy. Instead of trying to live forever, he'd work to ensure that what he built would last. Strong institutions, well-trained Aurors, reformed laws that protect the innocent and punish the guilty. Students he mentored who would carry on his work. A family that would remember him. Books and papers he'd written contributing to magical knowledge. Influence that would extend beyond his death because he'd shaped the world in positive ways. This would be a very different kind of immortality than what Voldemort sought. Not personal survival at any cost, but immortality through impact, through the things you create and the people you touch. It would require Tom to accept that he personally will end, but that what he was part of, what he built, what he taught, would continue. For someone as ego-driven as Tom, this would be a difficult lesson. But if he'd spent his entire adult life being shaped by Gryffindor values, by Dumbledore's philosophy, by friendships and family, he might be able to accept it. Picture Tom on his deathbed, elderly and knowing the end is near. Around him would be people whose lives he'd touched. Former students, colleagues, perhaps children and grandchildren. They're there because they genuinely care about him, not out of fear or obligation. Tom, even at the end, probably couldn't fully express love in return. But he'd recognize that these connections matter, that these people represent something important. And instead of raging against death, instead of trying desperately to cling to life like Voldemort did, Tom might face it with something approaching peace. Not because he's no longer afraid, but because he's learned courage. Because Gryffindor taught him that feeling fear but acting anyway is what bravery means. His final words might not be declarations of love or warm sentiments. Tom was never that person. But they might be something like, I did what I set out to do. I made a difference. That's enough. And for Tom Riddle, who spent his entire life terrified of being insignificant, of being forgotten, of being vulnerable, that recognition would represent enormous growth. The understanding that he doesn't need to live forever to matter, that a well-lived finite life has more value than eternal existence as a monster. After Tom's death, how would he be remembered? In the original timeline, Voldemort is remembered as history's darkest wizard, the monster who nearly destroyed wizarding society twice, the ultimate example of what happens when power corrupts completely. His name became a curse, something people fear to speak aloud. But Gryffindor Tom would have a completely different legacy. He'd be remembered as a complicated man who achieved great things despite his demons. As the Auror who revolutionized dark wizard fighting and made the wizarding world safer, as a mentor to generations of law enforcement professionals, as someone who had every reason and ability to become a Dark Lord but chose differently, his biography would be studied by students, not as a cautionary tale but as an example of how environment and choice can shape even someone with the darkest potential. There would probably be debates about Tom long after his death. Some would lionize him as a pure hero, ignoring his flaws and limitations. Others would point out his cold nature, his ruthless methods, the times he came close to crossing lines he shouldn't have. The most thoughtful assessments would acknowledge both, that Tom Riddle was a dangerous man who could have been a monster, but who was shaped by Gryffindor values and good mentors into someone who, despite his limitations, chose to protect rather than destroy. Dumbledore's eventual assessment of Tom would be crucial. Imagine Dumbledore in his final years, looking back on his decision to mentor Tom Riddle, on the risk he took in believing Tom could be more than his worst instincts. Dumbledore would acknowledge that it was always a gamble, that Tom remained dangerous his entire life, that there were moments when it could have gone either way. But Dumbledore would also take pride in the fact that they'd proven it was possible. That environment matters, that mentorship matters, that believing in someone's capacity for good, even when that capacity is limited, can make all the difference. The comparison between Tom Riddle and Harry Potter in this timeline would be interesting to the wizarding world. Harry, who in the original timeline was defined entirely by his opposition to Voldemort, wouldn't exist in the same way. But people would still compare the two. Both orphans, both Parselmouths, both incredibly powerful. They'd marvel at how different people with similar starts and abilities turned out, and they'd debate what made the difference. Most would conclude that it was love, that Harry was loved by his parents and then by his friends, while Tom never truly understood love. But more thoughtful observers might notice that it wasn't just love. It was also choices, environments, mentors, and the house system itself. The Sorting Hat placed both boys where they needed to be. For Harry, that was Gryffindor, where he'd find friends and learn to be a hero. For Tom, in this alternate timeline, it was also Gryffindor, not because he'd naturally fit, but because he needed to be challenged and shaped by those values. The Hat, in its ancient wisdom, would have seen that Tom in Slytherin would become Voldemort, but Tom in Gryffindor might become something else entirely. This brings us back to the fundamental question of the thought experiment. Can environment overcome nature? Can good influences and positive role models reshape someone with serious psychological issues and traumatic background into a functional, positive member of society? The answer, based on our deep exploration of this alternate timeline, is complicated. Tom Riddle would never be normal. His capacity for empathy would always be limited. His understanding of emotional connection would always be intellectual rather than felt. His fear of death would never fully disappear. His need for control would always be there, lurking beneath the surface. These fundamental aspects of his psychology, shaped by his conception, his upbringing, and possibly his inherent nature, wouldn't magically vanish because he slept in Gryffindor Tower instead of the Slytherin dungeons. But behavior can be shaped even when core psychology can't be changed. Tom could learn to act in pro-social ways even if his motivations remained self-interested. He could develop habits of helping others, of following rules, of choosing restraint over aggression. Over decades, these behaviors would become ingrained patterns, things he did automatically without having to consciously choose them every time. This is how character is built, through repeated choices that eventually become who you are. More importantly, environment would give Tom reasons not to become a Dark Lord. In Slytherin, surrounded by pure-blood supremacists and enablers of his worst instincts, Tom had every reason to pursue dark magic and power. It was validated, encouraged, seen as the natural path for someone of his abilities. But in Gryffindor, pursuing that path would mean losing everything he'd built. It would mean disappointing the mentors who believed in him, betraying the friends who trusted him, destroying his reputation and position. The cost would be too high, so Gryffindor wouldn't make Tom good in some pure moral sense. He'd always be operating from a more cynical, self-interested place than true heroes. But it would make him functional, productive, and ultimately a positive force in the wizarding world. And maybe that's enough. Maybe we don't need everyone to be saints. Maybe it's sufficient if people contribute positively to society, if they help more than they hurt, if they leave the world better than they found it, regardless of their internal emotional landscape. The tragedy of the original timeline is that Tom Riddle had the potential to be extraordinary in any direction. His intelligence, his power, his determination were all neutral qualities that could have been used for tremendous good or tremendous evil. Slytherin shaped him into Voldemort, the darkest wizard in history. But Gryffindor could have shaped him into something else, not a perfect hero, not someone warm and loving, but a complex, flawed individual who nevertheless chose to stand on the side of light. Think about how many lives would be different in this timeline. The thousands who died in the wars against Voldemort would live full lives. Families would stay intact. The entire generation that grew up in the shadow of the First Wizarding War would have normal childhoods instead of trauma and loss. The political divisions that Voldemort exploited and amplified might heal naturally over time rather than exploding into violence. The wizarding world would evolve gradually toward greater equality and justice, rather than being forced into sudden change by the crisis of war. But there would also be losses in this timeline, things that wouldn't exist without Voldemort. Harry Potter, as we know him, would never be born. The extraordinary friendships forged in the fight against Voldemort, the heroes who emerged because they had to, the lessons learned through terrible sacrifice, all of these would be absent. The wizarding world would be more peaceful, but perhaps also more complacent, lacking the crucible that forced people to examine their values and choose sides. This raises a philosophical question. Are the heroes created by fighting evil worth the existence of that evil? Obviously, the answer is no. No one would choose to have Voldemort exist just so Harry Potter could become a hero. But it's worth acknowledging that struggle creates strength, that crisis forces growth, that sometimes societies need to be shaken to their foundations to achieve real change. A world without Voldemort would be better in almost every way, but it would also be different in ways both good and bad. The ultimate answer to our question, what if Voldemort had been sorted into Gryffindor, is this: he wouldn't have become Voldemort at all. Tom Riddle would have lived a completely different life, shaped by different influences, making different choices, building a different legacy. He would still be a dangerous man, someone to watch carefully, someone whose darker instincts never fully disappear. But he would have been channeled toward the light, given reasons to build rather than destroy, taught that there are better ways to deal with fear and pain than causing fear and pain to others. The Sorting Hat's decision, in this timeline, would have literally changed the course of wizarding history. One small choice made by an enchanted hat on a boy's first night at school would ripple forward through decades, affecting thousands of lives, reshaping the entire magical world. It's a powerful reminder of how much our environments matter, how much the communities we're part of shape who we become, how much potential every person has to go in radically different directions, depending on the influences around them. Tom Riddle in Gryffindor would prove that while we can't always choose our nature, we can choose our nurture. That while some aspects of who we are might be fixed, other aspects are remarkably plastic, shaped by our experiences and relationships. That someone with every reason to become a monster can, with the right influences and enough personal determination, become something else. Not a saint, not a perfect hero, but someone who contributes positively to the world despite their limitations and demons. And that, ultimately, is a hopeful message. It says that people aren't destined to become their worst possibilities, that intervention matters, mentorship matters, community matters, that the effort to guide someone away from darkness, even when success isn't guaranteed, is worth making. Because sometimes that effort succeeds. Sometimes the boy who could have been history's greatest villain becomes, instead, a complicated hero who makes the world just a little bit better despite his flaws. So what if Voldemort had been sorted into Gryffindor? The wizarding world would be fundamentally different. Thousands would live who otherwise died. The Great Wars would never happen. And Tom Riddle, the boy who became history's darkest wizard, would instead become a man who fought against darkness, who protected rather than destroyed, who proved that your starting point doesn't determine your ending, that the house you're sorted into, the friends you make, the values you're taught, the choices you make in response to all of these, matter more than any prophecy, any bloodline, any predetermined fate. The Sorting Hat would have been right to bet on Tom's potential for courage, to place him where he'd be challenged and shaped rather than where he'd be comfortable and enabled. And Tom himself, by rising to that challenge, by becoming more than his worst instincts, would prove that the most important magic isn't about spells or power. It's about choice, about environment, about the communities that shape us and the values we choose to live by. That's the real magic of this alternate timeline, and that's why this question matters. Because it reminds us that different choices, different influences, different moments of intervention can change everything. And that hope, even for the most unlikely candidates, is never entirely misplaced.